Are you the daughter of Laban?
I am Rachel.
I am Jacob.
I am Rachel.
I am Jacob.
My father will be so happy to see you. Let me go and give him this news.
I am Jacob.
Hello, Bezel T3. I wanted to do something a little different for this Wednesday's publication or post of my video. Usually would do this on Tuesday. It's Monday because Tuesday I have a doctor's appointment, some follow-up stuff from that bladder cancer I had. I need a couple more treatments of what they call BCG. It has to get pumped into me, and then I'm like a rotisserie chicken afterwards. I go home in 15 minutes on either side, or all four sides actually, and then I don't feel very good for the rest of the evening. So, if you have an interest in what BCG is for bladder cancer, you can look that up, but I wouldn't. Anyways, what I want to do is I want to point you to the church of which I'm a member, the website that we have, valleypresbyterian.org, valleypresbyterian.org. If you go to I'm using the mobile right here on my iPad, go to those lines, just like on the phone, and you've got all your selections there. Go down to multimedia, and you've got audio video sermons. All the sermons that we do are there, but under Christian education, if you click on that, this is what happens at 10 a.m. before the service. And what I wanted to show you is that right now, I don't know how well you can see that because I know the focus is on me, but anyways, we are doing a walk through the Old Testament. We did New Testament last year. So we've been doing Genesis this entire year so far. We're at the beginning of March 1st, so that would bring us to Genesis 41. But I want to give you just a small portion of one of the teaching episodes that Pastor Jason Pedersen does for us. Every once in a while the senior pastor will jump in, but it's mostly Jason. Really good teacher. I know there's a bunch of stuff out there on the internet, more than you could possibly digest, but I think this is pretty good. And what I've found is that even in reading, even in trying to be deliberate and reading, by the way, before I get to that, here's how you get to the different episodes, you might say, for this series. And the one I want to give you a portion of is called Jacob and Laban. Laban, I don't know how to say it. He's a guy I never really understood much about. I didn't know much about him. I'd read the Old Testament, and sometimes it's like, if the Bible's an ocean, a lot of the times I'll read the Old Testament and I'm like a jet skier. Right? I'm on the surface, I'm on the ocean, but I'm just on the surface and I'm enjoying myself. But go below the surface as a scuba diver or a deep sea diver, and you're gonna get a lot more out of what you see and understand. That's a weird analogy, but whatever. Then what I wanted to show you is that you can go back to, I didn't want to do that, go back to the start here and go to your selections once again, the different tabs. It's under Ministries, the large tab Ministries, and then Old Testament Bible Reading Plan. That's what you're going to see as you click on that, the link there. You're going to get this. If you're at all interested in following along, and if you want to play catch up, you can go back to the first one in that multimedia and then Christian education and look at each one that Pastor Pedersen has done and read along and catch up. It'd be great. So anyways, what I wanted to give you is this one on Laban, because I didn't know much about him, but when you read the text and then you have someone who's a little bit more well-versed in Old Testament kind of biblical theology, not systematic theology, but biblical theology, you get such a great understanding of what's really going on. When I grew up, I used to enjoy what was called flannel-graph, and you have a board and all these flannel-graph figures that the Sunday school teacher would paste on the board, and well, these aren't flannel-graph figures. They're real people. This is real history. I know. It blows my mind. And real things are going on. You got real drama going on. So hang with it and listen to this portion of the teaching. And if you think that it's something you'd like to take a better look at, then go to the website and take advantage of all these teachings. So here we go with really it's focusing, this section is focusing on Jacob and Laban.
And so what happens here in 24, this is even before all that. This is basically Abraham, with his dying breath, commanding the master of his house, who is probably Eliezer of Damascus. We're introduced to him in chapter 15. The one who has charge over all Abraham's sheepdom. And he says, don't take a son for Isaac, or a wife from these women from the land. Go to my father's house and take a wife. And he makes this guy pledge and put his hand under his thigh and do this huge ordeal. And then he sends his servant, Eliezer of Damascus, on the way to go fetch a bride for Isaac. And you notice this guy is we're introduced to Laban at this point, okay? And you remember what happens when Eliezer goes to the well. You see wells and women, a significant theme in Genesis, often where the brides are found there. We're in Genesis 24. Genesis 24. So pick up with me. We're introduced to Laban here. We see Laban's now, he's a piece of work here in chapters 29 through 33. But we want to get some context for this family drama, all these relationships. Jacob wants to go with his wives, all his kids. He's probably got 10, 11 kids now, and his wives, he wants to go out from Laban. He's been there about 14 years and then some. And Laban says, hey, no, name your wages. So he goes from dealing with them as basically family to now a servant. He's seen that he's been blessed, he's been prospered because of Jacob. He's learned that by divinization, right? But we're introduced to Laban much earlier, and we see hints in his character. So look there in chapter 24. Eliezer prays he's going to be blessed. And what happens is he sees Rebekah. Pick up with me there in chapter 15. Verse 15 of chapter 24. He's praying, right, that God's going to show steadfast love and faithfulness and show this wife. And he sees, before he finished speaking, verse 15 of 24, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went to the spring and filled her jar up. And I'll skip to the point. Basically, she fills her jar up. She offers water to him, and then she waters the camels. So you think just, obviously a clear sign, right? And so immediately what does he do? He puts the ring, not on the finger, but in the nose, and he puts these big sheckled bracelets on her wrists. And as soon as she gets these things, she hauls all the way back to the house. And listen to how shrewd Laban is. Good guy, shrewd guy. We're going to learn a little bit more. So look what Eliezer of Damascus says in verse 26. He finds out she's of Abraham's descendants. Verse 26. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord, and said, "Blessed be the Lord, right, Yahweh, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman." Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. What things? What do you think? The visitor, his riches, the ring, and she steps on the scene, and you notice the language is very subtle here. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. This is the first time we're introduced to him. Laban ran out to the man to the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms and heard the words of Rebekah his sister, "Thus the man spoke to me." He went to the man. And behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. He said, "Come in. I got a house. I got food. I got fodder. I've got water, right? I've got all this." And he comes in, and this guy says, "You know what? Listen, I'm not going to have any of that stuff unless I tell you on what business I came here for." And so you think Laban, he hears about the blessing of Abraham, right? He sees the gold, and he's sprinting out of that house as fast as he can to get this guy to come in. And so maybe he's an honorable man, showing good hospitality. But then we see, of course, this servant. If you read 25:4, which you probably did, he tells a story in painstaking detail, doesn't he? It's like painstaking detail about Abraham and the sign and what he promised to do and the vow he made. And he tells all of that. And basically, if you look in verse 50, verse 49, read this. This is a great little verse here. "Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love," he's talking to Laban and his family, "steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or the left. So you think about this guy, right? This guy's like straight to the point. And the reason why is because when he was going back and forth with Abraham, they made the vow to put the hand under the thigh that he's going to get a wife from his father's house. He says, well, Abraham, what if they don't want to give a wife? Then what? Abraham says, oh, you're free from your vow. And so this guy's not touching a bite of food or anything until either he knows he can fulfill his vow to Abraham or he's free from it. And they want to give him food. And he cuts to the point, he says, are you going to be loyal to your descendant's house and fulfill this oath? It's clearly from the Lord. He's got riches. And they say, well, of course, it's of the Lord. And then look what he does. He gives out all this jewelry, gold. He gives costly ornaments. They eat and drink. He spends the night. But then we get a hint at Laban's character here. And this family, right? Look what they say. He says, send me away, verse 54. Send me away to my master. Her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. Then after that she may go. Does that remind you of anything? What does it remind you of? Laban trying to keep Jacob a generation later, over and over. Keep him. Where do you think he learned it? Maybe he's the originator. This family is very shrewd here. They're not sinless. They're not perfect. So he says, look at this guy. Do not delay me. Eliezer, right? Abraham's servant. Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. Well, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and said to her, will you go with this man? She said, I will go. So they sent away Rebekah. So they send her away, right? And then they give her a blessing. But we see basically this story of Laban initially treating Jacob as kinsman, as family. And then now and he swindled him 7 years, 7 more years, and now he wants to go. He's got all his wives, he's got all, his flocks. Not all the flocks, but he's been good, he's got a little bit of sheepdom. Laban's been blessed, and he's got tons of livestock. And now Laban won't let him go, and they're having this dispute about wages. And so you see Jacob's going to be very shrewd. And remember, he takes all the spotted, not top-tier sheep, and he takes them away, and then he leaves Laban all the nice ones. So it's a clear demarcation between what's mine and yours. You're not going to let me go? He realizes Laban has a lot of power. Laban could, strike him down. Laban could just withhold, his daughters and his children, his wives and his children and their servants from him. Jacob's not in a great position. And so when you think of what's happened to Jacob, it's an interesting story, because as he gets ready to go to Laban, the sun sets, and he has this great vision of the stairway of God, angels descending and ascending Bethel, and the sun sets. And he goes into this amazing, transformation. And the transformation only happens because of his suffering and his afflictions and his trials. And it's not just that he changes overnight from being a mama's boy and doing whatever mama said to do, to moving like a rock at a well, and to laboring for these women and dealing with Laban's shenanigans. This is one big story. And if you look at how he's changed, look in how he moves the stone in chapter 29, and then we skip ahead and you see that Laban begins his disposition begins to change toward Jacob, right? Laban's attitude changes. If you look in verses 30-32, he wants to go, but he takes the sheep. He takes, the sticks, and he begins to breed them. What's God doing with Jacob and Laban as we zoom out? What do you see happening, knowing redemptive history, knowing what you know? What battle is at work here when you think of it? What's happening here in the broader story, in Exodus 31, okay, when Jacob begins to flee Laban, we have a couple things. We have the 2 seeds issue, but then we have also an Exodus issue. Both of these things are at play. When you think of when Jacob goes out and he's fleeing from Laban, Laban's attitude changes from Jacob, not just from like a kinsman to a servant. Now he's not regarding him as he was before, which means like there's this outright hostility, like bitterness. Oh, look at all the speckled sheep are growing. Mine are kind of staying the same or dwindling. Like outright hostility. And Jacob comes to the point where he's like, man, I got to make a run for it. And so that's what he does in 31. And so there's this Exodus pattern, because when you think of the Egyptians, right? Similar to how Egypt's attitude changed towards Israel. You think of the bride price. Look at 31:14. 31:14. When he tells his wives, listen, we got to go. Then Rachel and Leah answered him, is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? What do they mean by that? The bride price, among other things. Laban had squandered the bride price that Jacob worked 14 years for. Like that was to be kept for them in case Jacob, died or was unfaithful or forsook them. Like Laban squandered that. Laban's kept that for himself. There's nothing. And so they're going to have to make a run for it. The two seeds also, we see this constant battle in Scripture between the offspring of the woman, of the promise, of those who look to the gospel, of those who trust in Christ. And here, the physical, bloodline. And Satan, who wants to steal, kill, and destroy, and cut off and prevent this Christ, this offspring of the woman from ever coming to conquer him and to overcome sin and death and alienation. He'd rather keep people in bondage and hostile toward one another. But this Exodus pattern is very big, because when you think, when's Israel reading the story? They're reading the story either on the plains of Moab, right after they come out of, they cross the Red Sea. And so what you have is basically this humiliation. If you look at the gods that are taken from Laban, do you remember who stole them? Rachel stole them. Yeah, she sat on them. You have this similar theme in the Exodus pattern in which all the Egyptian gods were humiliated with each of those plagues, right? The water, the agriculture, the animals, the whole nine. They're humiliated with each of those plagues. It's not just these signs out of the blue. God's humiliating the Egyptian gods. And so Rachel steals these little gods. Basically, he's in the tent looking for them. He can't find his gods, right? And then she says basically, hey, the way of the woman is with me. And so when you think of it, it's this weird reversal, is that women often, these stories of deception, you think of the woman being deceived by the serpent. Throughout Scripture, you see these stories of deception where women are deceiving those who are trying to destroy the seed, the offspring of Christ, with their, contriving or conniving or just wise deceit. I don't know is that a proper statement? Is that a sin? What do you think of that, Larry? I know you pressed me last week on that. Think of the Hebrew midwives deceiving Pharaoh. What's more important to them? Breaking the 9th commandment? I'm not saying it's okay to lie. Or unjustly murdering innocent life. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. They're strong women, they're vigorous, they give birth really fast. That's what they say, basically. I paraphrase it. And so when you think of the 10 commandments, love God, love others, love yourself, the whole issue with the parable of the Good Samaritan, remember the travelers left for dead on the side of the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And the two people that pass by, I think you have a Pharisee and a Levitical priest. Is that right? You're on the spot. And they see this unclean Gentile who's basically left for dead on the side of the road. And the thing about the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is that it gets super narrow. So narrow that you got to pass by with your livestock like this at certain points. And so more than likely, Jesus is emphasizing that part of the road when they try to pass by on the other side. They're doing a hurdle over the guy. And the thing is, what's more important to them? Preserving and promoting life or being ceremonially clean? Being ceremonially clean. Right? And so what they've done is they've miscategorized the commandments. Promoting life and preserving life is always love God and worship God ultimately. But when it comes to this horizontal sphere, promoting, go ahead.
It just makes me think of a story from Corrie ten Boom, which he related lying to the Nazis, the SS people coming to ask if she had Jews that she was hiding, and she said no. And they left, and she quickly repented for lying.
Yeah,
But she lied to them.
right. And she lied to them. Why? What was the end of these people who were at her door?
Preserving life.
Yeah, there was murder, and she was trying to preserve life. And yeah, she repented of lying. Praise God, because she did lie. But the end is to preserve life. Remember Rahab deceiving what? The men of Jericho.
So wait a minute, question. So are you saying that it's okay to sin if you have the right motive?
No.
So
Motives is...
I think what she was saying is when faced with two sins, she's going to have to sin one way or the other, and that she chose to sin to preserve life, and then deal with the sin that remained.
There's degrees of sinfulness. Remember, he who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin. And you're like, what? James says you broke one commandment, you've broken them all. Boom, they're all like the same, right? That's what people think. All sin, yeah, all the wages of sin is death. All sin is deserving of death. But there are some sins that are so terrible, they have these insane consequences. Like, what is it? Who it's done against? How it's done? Like, sin is absolutely terrible. Don't ever justify your sin. I'm not saying that. Don't get to the point where you're saying, well, I think I'm loving myself this way, so I'll sin against God. Like, that's the wrong category. Like, the category that we have here is one of like murder and physical harm. That's the category. And the other option is deceit. And so I'm saying God has a sense of humor because he's using people according to their nature. And the way that the woman was deceived in the garden from the serpent, God often uses these women to deceive. You think of it with Hebrew midwives, right? What else?
Hiding of Joash, right?
Yeah.
The line to come to the Messiah was down to one king, a baby, and so
Yeah.
he was hidden by I can't remember who, but somebody wanted to kill him.
Right, they're after him.
Yeah.
Yeah. Haman is deceived by Esther. All sorts of different ones. Michal, remember her, has deceived Saul about David. Like, it's this sense of humor, like reversal. Not that God like blesses sin and says, yes, sin. But you remember there was this huge issue back with Ahab when Jehoshaphat came up to Ahab and they wanted to go to war. I think maybe it was against Samaria or somebody, okay? And he's like, come up with me and fight. And Jehoshaphat's like, hey, we're kin, we're families, right? We're one Israel. This is like 1,000 years later. Your enemies are my enemies. Let's get down to business. But first, is there any prophet you can call? He's like, yeah, I got all these prophets. And they're putting horns on their head and they're dancing around. They're like, yeah, God's going to give you victory, man. Ahab, go do it. They're like dancing around being crazy. And Jehoshaphat's like, listen, is there anyone else that we can ask? Because he sees it's just shenanigans. It's just pure people, but they're yes men. They're telling Ahab what he wants to hear. And he's like, yeah, Ahab says, yeah, I got one guy. But, he always prophesies not good for me, but evil. So I don't like to get this guy. I don't like to hear what he has to say. And he's like, well, go ahead and call him. And so they call this guy up, right? And the thing is, like, you get this behind the scenes picture is that they're in the heavenly sanctuary and God says, who's going to go deceive Ahab? Something to that effect. I shouldn't paraphrase scripture. And this lying spirit says, I will. And God says, how are you going to do it? He says, I'll be a deceitful spirit in the mouth of his prophets. And so when you think of this great statement, Patty, can you shut that door? Is that okay? There's a great statement, basically, that Luther says. He says, you have to remember, even the devil is God's devil. And what he means by that is, and this is very important for Jacob, and we'll get to it in a minute, is that God always uses things according to their nature. Without creating sin, without creating evil, but uses things according to their nature. And when you think of the common or preservative grace of God, it keeps us from being maybe as bad as we could be. It's very preservative. And if God removes that just a little bit, then Pharaoh's heart becomes as hard as a rock, right? Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And so this prophet that Ahab calls, he comes up and he prophesies, yeah, God's going to give you victory. And he's like, this is like the first time Ahab's ever heard a blessing from this prophet, right? Usually he tells him evil, not good. And he's like, you got to tell me the truth here. And he's like, well, you're going to get struck down. He's like, why'd you lie to me? well, he's afraid for his life. But then he ends up telling the truth. And sure enough, Ahab's in battle and he dies. But the story was God always uses things according to their nature. Satan, demons, Christians to come to our aid for good, unbelievers with great competence to come to our aid for good. Like God's using it all. And so this whole issue with Laban, that Jacob, I don't think he realizes this until he really wrestles with God, is that there's this great there and back story. And I want to skip ahead to chapter 32. Because what you see for Jacob is when he's wrestling with God. I'll just read it. And the context is, okay, Jacob's gone away from Laban. He's been on the run. Laban charged after him and overtook him. God came to Laban and said, don't you hurt him, right? And so Laban says, I would have blessed you. I would have done good. I would have done all this. All you had to do was ask. Is that true? It's true to Laban, right? Every way of a man's right in his own eyes. Laban 100% believes that. I think he sincerely does. And Jacob's like, okay, well, we're going to go. You humiliated me. He can't find the household gods. And then he hears Esau's coming. Remember Esau? Last time they saw each other, Jacob was told by his parents, hey, you got to go get a wife. He's gone for 14 years. And then some to have all these cattle, probably almost 20 years later. And Esau's always kind of hung over his head. And so when you think of Jacob, like throughout his life, he's been a wrestler. He's wrestled his brother.